Welcome back to God's Lawyer Podcast. We're going to jump right back in where we left off on this topic, Jesus in the Talmud. If you don't know what the Talmud is, we covered that in episode 1, but it's basically the most influential writings in Rabbinic Judaism. Some of you say, I thought the Old Testament was. Well, the Talmud is the Jewish legal interpretation of the Old Testament and really serves as the authoritative commentary. So what does it say about Jesus? Well, we covered a few things in previous episodes. In episode 2 and episode 3, we covered the origins, according to the Talmud, of Jesus. It claimed that Jesus was the product of an adulterous affair, and that he is essentially then the son of a whore and a bastard. And somebody say, that's some strong language, Pastor. Well, that's the language that's being used. And so that's what I'm going to do, is be faithful into the portrayal of it. Looking to our source is a book, Jesus in the Talmud, by Peter Schaeffer. Schaeffer is a professor of Judaic studies at Princeton University, and he provides a scholarly and compelling case for the portrayal of Jesus in the Talmud as Jesus, son of Pendera, or son of Ben Stada, son of Stada. So he wants us to understand that while the Talmud doesn't have a section dedicated specifically to Jesus, we find throughout the Talmudic writings references that he brings together and shows and tries to demonstrate that in the 3rd century, later developed and edited in the 5th and 7th century, the Talmud presents Jesus as not having divine origins, just the opposite, of being an idolater who worships bricks. Yes, you'll hear that in the previous episode, who was a poor student whose rabbi pushed him away with both hands, which means it's not just a matter of repentance, but to push away that way is to push him away as someone who is evil and has no claim or right then to teach the Torah. So every aspect of Jesus' ministry, origins, ministry, life, claims, all being dismantled throughout these Talmudic references. Now, you say, what do we do as Christians? How do we respond to this? Well, immediately the charge, anytime that you're going to talk about anything related to Judaism or the teachings of the rabbis, you always run the risk of being referred to as anti-Semitic. But listen, you and I as Christians can't be afraid of labels. As soon as we're afraid of someone may call us a name, that truly it ties us down in a way that doesn't allow us to have meaningful engagement. So as I walked through in previous episodes, the Talmud presents Jesus as having scandalous origins, that he is an idolater, one who practiced magic, that he is a poor student, a poor disciple, and a horrible son. All the things in Jewish life that were important, according to the Talmud, Jesus is the opposite. Remember, I've said already that the Talmud is not presenting a historical narrative of Jesus. It's not presenting itself as even being historically accurate. It's just these hyperbolic, exaggerated polemics against Jesus and thus against Christianity. So let's jump in this last episode to Jesus' death and execution according to the Talmud.
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saved.
Now, Christians historically have believed, because the New Testament testifies, there was eyewitnesses testifying that Jesus, who Christians believe, and I confess, is the Messiah, the promised and long-awaited King and Savior of the world, that he was put to death, that there were 2 trials, in a sense, the sham trial in front of the Sanhedrin, and then the equally shameful trial in front of Pilate. Both of these trials have been examined in great depth and great length. I've examined them in a series myself. That I don't know if that's on this channel or not. We'll reference it another time. But looking at those trials, you have the Talmud wanting to come in and discuss Jesus' death, trials. Of course, as Christians, we believe that he was buried and then he rose again on the 3rd day. And so that is all going to serve as, if you will, the basis for these polemics, or polemic is like a counter-narrative. We might even use the word an attack. That's probably a strong word, although it may fit the context. But it's an attempt to discredit a claim. So it's polemical in the sense that it's not apologetical, would be defending a position. Polemical is going on the offensive and taking on the other narrative. So Jesus' death and execution, how did Jesus die? Why did he die? One reference to Jesus' trial and execution in the Talmudic writings claims the following. Listen to these 4 points. So according to the Talmud, that on Passover Eve, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged. Now, I want to go back to something I mentioned in a previous episode, and that is when you have these references to Jesus' death, they basically, it's this idea that Jesus was stoned to death, and that in being executed, then hung, and then later nailed to a tree. So they're trying to bring together these traditions, but then also certainly not necessarily rooted in history, but bringing together, compiling these different traditions, narratives, counter-narratives, all together in one. So this idea that he was hanged, now hanging can have a couple variations in their mind, so that we think of hanging by a noose or hanging someone from a tree. Nonetheless, number 2, a herald went out for 40 days saying, now of course you got to understand, according to their counter-narrative, Jesus is arrested and he's held in custody for a long period of time. Of course, we know in the Gospels he's arrested, and then later that night there is this sham trial being put on by the Sanhedrin. But saying that there were 40 days, now I'm of the opinion this reference to 40 days is probably a counter-narrative to the gospel claim. Of course, we see it in the book of Acts. So when I say a gospel claim, the history of Jesus doesn't end in the Gospels. It continues into the early part of the book of Acts. So I think the 40 days is to jump on that 40 days that we find recorded in the Christian narrative. So they say there was a herald, a messenger went out for 40 days saying, quote, Jesus the Nazarene is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and led Israel into idolatry. Whoever knows anything in his defense, come forward and state it, end quote. So according to the Talmud, now there's nothing historically to support this or back this up. As I've mentioned in the other episodes, listen, the bottom line is that the exaggerations are to be expected, because it's in a way, it isn't just polemical. So it's not just an academic exercise. It's in a sense mocking. We think of modern day, for example, I think here recently in the Paris Olympics, the mocking of Christianity. This is nothing new. There's that art, not art, but you find the cave drawing. I use the word art inappropriately there. But there's this cave drawing that we find, I believe I don't know if it's from the 1st century or 2nd century. It's early on in Christianity, within the first 3 centuries, I believe. And it has this man, but it has the head of a donkey, and he's being crucified. And then it has written on there, I think it's like maybe making fun of someone named Alexander or Alexandrus. You can look it up yourself. But essentially saying that this person worships a donkey or a fool. Might even think of the old word worships. We used to call donkeys a jackass. And so it's making a reference to him in a derogatory way for worshiping Christ. There's nothing new here. Absolutely nothing new. So this idea here is that there's this herald that goes out, and he says, listen, Jesus is a sorcerer, an idolater. Is there anyone who can provide a defense for him? 40 days. So this is clearly exaggerated. I mean, sitting out at Herald for 40 days, Jesus is supposedly in prison for 40 days. There's nothing historical to back this up. It's a complete exaggeration to mock Christ and Christianity. Of course, most Christians have no idea what the Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism really believes about Jesus. Why? Because most of evangelical Christianity has been influenced by the charlatan C.I. Scofield. And again, I want to point out, I think I've pointed out in each episode, do your homework, go find out who was the money behind the publishing of the C.I. Scofield Study Bible. In fact, what happens in the course of that study Bible being promoted is that his notes become we would say kind of deuterocanonical. That is, they take on this authoritative position that for many, that you can find, there are some that go on record essentially to deny Scofield's interpretation of the Bible. For some people, is to deny the Bible. It is a strange thing to me to think that a man whose reputation, I mean, you're talking about a man, C.I. Scofield, who had abandoned, wouldn't take care of his own children, abandoned his wife, and some really, if you think about the fact that no one knows hardly anything about him, but there's a book out that is exposing that he had claimed to be a lawyer, owed people money. There's a lot of scandalous things about this man. Follow the money. Go and ask yourself, who's the money behind the C.I. Scofield Study Bible in its promotion? So allegedly, Jesus supposedly on Passover is hung, but prior to that, for 40 days, there's a herald that's sent out saying, is there anyone who come into his defense? Since no witnesses, according to the Talmud, since no witnesses came forward in his defense, they hung him on the Sabbath eve and the eve of Passover. So there's the first two. Number three, that no defense could be made for him. Not just simply that no defense came forward, but that no defense could be made for him. Fourth, that Jesus had close friends in the government. That's probably a reference here. You got the story of Pilate talking to Jesus in private, even coming forward, certainly giving the impression in the Gospels that he wants to release Jesus. Of course, he says, should I release to you Jesus, who's called the Christ, or Barabbas? Of course, keep in mind some of the early manuscripts in Matthew, and I believe it was some maybe in the Syriac language, offer the first name of Barabbas, who many believe, based on the manuscript evidence, although that's a minority of manuscripts. Think about this. They come in a second translation, which would be strange that they would add information like that to a second language. It comes from Greek then to another language. It seems to me that there's substantial evidence to establish that Barabbas, which just means son of the father, bar, son of the father, son of a father, that his first name was probably also Jesus in the Hebrew, some form of it sounding something like Yeshua. So which Jesus do you want? And, of course, the crowd wants him to release Barabbas, who isn't just a robber. He is an insurrectionist, someone who was leading an insurrection. And the two men that are crucified with Jesus are probably also part of his gang of insurrectionists. It says that Barabbas had actually even committed murder, probably killed an important official. So it's interesting that he's the one that's released. But so in the gospel narrative, Pilate is inquisitive of who Jesus is. Where did he come from? So you get this idea that Jesus had a close friend in the government, probably a reference to Pilate's attempts to offer up, Barabbas in the place of Jesus, vice versa, whatever. Now, I think that when we go back and we consider all of this, there's some more information that Schaeffer wants us to consider before making a final conclusion here. He points out that in the Bavli narrative, it states that Jesus was first stoned, then hung. Now, why would that be important in an attack against the gospel truths? And by the way, this is a matter, I think, for the validity of the gospel. This is a question of the validity of Christianity, because this isn't a matter of we just got a few things wrong. When it comes to Christ and the Gospels, there's not an option for us to have this 90% right about Jesus. That's not an option. This is either we are completely wrong or completely right. Because you can't have, for example, let's go back to the birth narrative. Jesus, who's not God's son, let's say that according to the Talmud and according, obviously, to writings like the Quran, he's just a man. He's not divine. And he dies, and he supposedly dies for sins. Well, he can't. He couldn't have even died for his own sins, because if he was just human, he couldn't have been perfect. He would have had sin imputed to him, original sin imputed to him. Couldn't even have died for his own sins. What a useless existence then to have lived and died and claimed that you were something that you weren't and could do something that you couldn't. What a waste. The other thing is if the Gospels don't present an accurate portrayal of not only the origins, life, and death, or trial, death, execution, resurrection of Jesus, if that's not an accurate presentation, then where would we go? Oh, we should go nowhere. There's no reason to even pursue this. So when we think about what's being said here, at each step of Jesus' life and ministry, the Talmud is providing a counter-narrative to his origins, counter-narrative to his ability to perform miracles. Not that there's no question whether he performed them, but the question is, how does he get the ability to? You have questions of what sort of son was he, what sort of student was he, and of course he's placed in these lists of notorious characters who allegedly have no place in the afterlife, the likes of Titus and Balaam, a whole list. In fact, I want to point out here on that list again. You've got Dagog, the Edomite, and then you also have Ahithophel, the advisor to Absalom, who convinced Absalom to try to overthrow his father. A list of notorious characters. So now the idea is to attack the trial and death of Jesus in a counter-narrative. So first of all, by saying Jesus was stoned, then hung, what they're saying now is that the Jewish authorities, the Sanhedrin, had the authority to carry out the execution of an idolater. Now, the thing is what I want you to understand here, and this is where I think some of us need to just hit pause and understand. How is it that, now some say, well, the Jews just didn't have the authority to stone an idolater to death. Well, of course, they didn't have necessarily the legal authority to do that, but they did do it, not with Jesus. For example, you can think of Stephen. We can just go a few chapters in the book of Acts and see Stephen stoned to death. Okay, so it's not that wasn't happening. The question we need to come to is say, okay, in the Roman world, why would the Romans have paid any attention to Jesus at all? I mean, if he's just a teacher, if he's just a rabbi, he's just considered a heretic, an idolater by the Jews, this isn't something that would have gotten Pilate's attention, nor is it something that the Romans would have cared anything about. In fact, if we look at the narrative, when we ask, who do they have in prison in the gospel narratives there at the end? Well, we find in prison, the Bible, New Testament translates it, many versions in English, robbers. I think that's a horrible way to translate the word that essentially means an insurrectionist, someone who's trying to overthrow, somebody who wants to intentionally overthrow the governing powers. So just to say they were robbers, I honestly, the translators do us a great disservice there. The two men, the two quote-unquote thieves on the cross with Jesus aren't just thieves. They didn't just steal something from the marketplace. They are part of a group of co-conspirators, I think with Barabbas as the head, who are trying to overthrow the government. So what is it that gets Rome's attention about Jesus? Well, Jesus is portrayed as someone who's attempting to overthrow the governing authorities. Now, you say, give us evidence of that. All right, let's just hit pause for a moment. See, the problem is that we've read the Bible and we already start with conclusions. We don't actually try to read it as historians, bringing all the facts together and really thinking through this. The other thing is that most of us have been taught to read the Bible basically like systematic theologians. You just pick a topic and you go look for something that kind of fits the need. 1 week, okay, 1 week, well, not a full week, but approximately a week before Jesus' arrest, let's say 4 to 5 days, okay, depending on how you measure the calendar, is a day that Christians call Palm Sunday. Now, why is that? Because they were laying down palm branches and declaring that essentially you have one riding in on a donkey and essentially declaring that the king has arrived. It's funny, the Gospels really start out this way, with you have the Magi, the kingmakers, coming and saying, "Where is he who's to be born the King of the Jews?" Of course, we know that Jesus wasn't just the King of the Jews. Psalm chapter 2 promises to be the King of the nations to be given to him as in his inheritance. So here you have an individual who's just rode into town a few days prior, and the crowds are worked up and declaring that Hosanna. I mean, think about that, the shouts filling the streets. Here's the one who's coming, the long-awaited promised son of David. Well, that's going to get everyone's attention. That's not something that's minor. That is a major activity. Well, that's gotten people's attention, and it doesn't take long, and we find that Jesus is arrested. Now, when they come out to arrest him, when you look at the text, they probably send out about 600 soldiers. And if you notice in the text, essentially you have Jesus saying here something of, you've come out after me as if I'm a robber or thief. But again, it's the same phrase for insurrectionist. And so they're coming out looking for this insurrectionist. They're looking for this one who they believe or have been told is leading a massive uprising against Rome. So the idea that Rome then would just defer to the Sanhedrin and give them the authority to stone Jesus to death, I mean, you have to become very creative, and then also, not only you have to become very creative, you have to reject what we know about what's going on in first century in the Roman-occupied Israel. Now, with that in mind, the idea here is to shift in the Talmud away from actual history, what we know, not just in the Gospel, but what we know about how the Romans conducted themselves when they were living as the oppressors. And I use that word appropriately here because that's what they were. It's important for the Talmud to pull away from this idea of Jesus as an insurrectionist and focus only on the Talmudic view of Jesus as an idolater, as a, if you will, a heretic, someone who's a sorcerer. So this is the portrayal of Jesus. So he dies as such, is what the Talmud wants you to understand. He dies as a sorcerer. He dies as a heretic. So in the Bavli narrative, Jesus is stoned, then hung. And we have here this admission that Jesus, in this account, that this idea that Jesus was a Jewish heretic who was quite successful in seducing many of Israel, but he was taken care of according to Jewish law, got what he deserved, and that's the end of the story. You can find that reference in Schaeffer's work, page 72. That's it. The story's over. It's done. He got what he deserved. But the Talmud doesn't stop there. That's not the end of the story in the Talmud. You say, again, why are we talking about this? Well, I've mentioned this in the earlier episodes. Here's why we're talking about this. Because you need to be able to faithfully expound God's Word, to teach people God's Word, but you also need to faithfully understand culture and the culture around you. I don't know if the episode is posted yet, but I did one on folk Christianity not too long ago. I mean, if you're going to pastor and evangelize in the South, you've got to understand folk Christianity. It's not biblical Christianity, but you've got to understand that. And if you're going to be effective in reaching Muslims, you need to understand Islam and the various forms of it. If you're going to evangelize Jews, you need to understand Judaism, and particularly Rabbinic Judaism and the Talmud's influence on it. So the story doesn't stop there in the Talmud. The Talmud wants to go a step further. And every aspect of the portrayal of Jesus in the Talmud is never portraying him simply in this neutral sense. There's not a neutral portrayal. Now, you might be able to pull out a reference here or there, okay, but the overall picture is one of we think of it in modern terms of call someone toxic or something toxic. The idea of to be associated with Jesus as a Jew would be to associate with the worst kind of person. So Jesus' punishment for this horrible life as a heretic, according to the Talmud, is a life eternal life, condemned to hell. Jesus' punishment, according to the Talmud, is if you want to talk about opposites, this is the most opposite view you could have of Jesus from the portrayal of him in the New Testament and the book of Acts. Well, certainly the Gospels and the book of Acts and the New Testament in its totality. From the portrayal of the exalted Christ who's reigning to a heretic in hell. Complete opposite portrayal. As I mentioned in episode 1, I mean, think about the portrayal of Jesus in the Quran in Islam. He's a prophet, and certainly they don't believe he's the Son of God, but he's a prophet, someone who should be revered as a prophet. While I disagree that with the Islamic portrayal of Jesus, the worst possible portrayal of Jesus is found in the Talmudic writings, which, again, as I've pointed out over and over and over, is the most influential literary work in Rabbinic Judaism, period. Now, if you are a blind student of the likes of C.I. Scofield, well, you've probably already turned this channel off, so you're not listening to anything I'm saying, or you're posting rants about anything that I'm saying here, any criticism being anti-Semitic. The idea that you can't criticize, the minute we say we can't criticize any religion, any faith, any position, any ideology, is the minute that we have succumbed to Marxism and to tyrants. So that's a no-go for me. We're going to talk openly about things. Jesus is listed with others who are condemned to hell in the Talmudic writings. Here's just a few of them. You have Titus. And of course, you remember Titus burned the temple to ashes. So it's fitting that you would, I guess, find from the Jewish perspective in the Talmud that there is a decree, allegedly, from God, that Titus is burned and his ashes scattered, but not just once, but repeatedly. So the Talmud presents Titus, the Roman general who destroys Jerusalem in AD 70, as being perpetually burned to ashes, ashes scattered, regathered, and over and over and over and over. Number 2, Balaam. Balaam is punished in boiling semen for trying to curse Israel and, if you remember, enticing Israel to sexual perversion. You can cross-reference this, Numbers 31, verse 16. So the portrayal of Balaam, that's pretty horrible. So what you're noticing is that the punishment that the Talmud ascribes to these individuals is directly related to their alleged sin in this life, at least sin against the Jewish people. So you notice that. Sin against the Jewish people, that's your recompense. That's what you deserve in hell, both times. Now, number 3 here on the list, Jesus. Interesting, though. Nothing directly said of his crime here, okay? Now, of course, you get that in other places. But here, at this point, at this reference, nothing said of his crime. Now, maybe it's taken for granted that the writers believe that through all the other references to Jesus, because in the Talmud there's in a section called Jesus, the references are scattered throughout, and Schaeffer brings them together. However, his punishment is to sit in boiling excrement. You might use the word feces, crap, poop, whatever. Boiling crap for eternity. That's again, how naive so many Christians are. Unbelievably naive. This idea that everything is this kind of ecumenical universalism, that we all basically believe the same thing, all believe in the same God. You can't tell me that another religion believes in the same God of Christianity when they have the key person within your religion condemned to hell and setting in boiling crap. Can you imagine, trying to convince, okay, let's say that Christians believed that Muhammad is in hell in boiling excrement. Now, Christians would testify that Muhammad would be in hell because he did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But taking it even a step further and saying, not only would I say, I believe he's in hell, but he's in hell and constantly, forever boiling in his own crap. That isn't just, listen, that's not just a doctrinal statement. Okay, it's, all right, look, I've talked to Muslim leaders over the years, most people who want to defend another religion that's not theirs have probably spent no time actually interacting with people in that religion. So you can usually tell. You get some idealists that's straight out of college, and because they one time met somebody at a party who supposedly held a different religion, and they're friends, then that you can't criticize the religion. Look, I can tell you right now, I've met with leaders of local mosque. I did a lot of ministry there in Louisville when I was in seminary. We sit down, we were honest. I can remember one gentleman, his name Omar, had a conversation with him. He just point blank said, I said, look, you believe I'm going to hell, right? Yep. I said, okay, because I don't follow your beliefs. Yep. I said, you I believe the same thing because you don't believe in Jesus Christ, that you're going to hell. Yeah, we're just honest about it, okay? So that's a doctrinal statement, okay? That's not a personal attack. Me saying that I believe that Muhammad is in hell because he denied the claims of Jesus Christ's divinity, okay, that's not an attack. That's not a personal attack on a Muslim. That's not a personal attack on Islam. That's a doctrinal statement, okay? But to go further and to say that there's a special punishment being carried out on Muhammad or Buddha or any other religious leader is to go beyond a doctrinal confession and engage in a malicious attack. So the Talmud the Talmud is not ashamed of this. It's proud of it. Of course, it's funny because we live in this environment where, where are the Christian men just to stand up and just call a spade a spade? We live in an environment today where, everybody's so brave to call out Luther and his egregious comments about Jews. No problem there. No, I'm not saying no problem with the comments. I'm saying no problem with addressing and condemning Luther's comments and statements that he writes later in his life, probably out of frustration, a man of his times. You say you're making excuses. I'm not making excuses. I'm going to provide the context, but we should still be critical. You got every beta male running headlong into, we're more than happy to attack Luther. However, when you want to analyze this, we're all running for the hills. No one wants to actually talk about the visceral comments about Jesus coming from the Talmud, because then that immediately becomes taboo. You can't say anything. Well, no, we're going to say something, because this isn't a misrepresentation. This is a faithful and accurate representation, which I've openly stated not only on this channel, but we've made phone calls. The producer made phone calls to rabbis asking simply to let us present this information and then respond. Disprove it, respond to it, provide a counter to this. Here's the deal. Well, you have Jesus presented as spending eternity in hell in boiling excrement. That's not just a doctrinal statement. That is a clear attack, not just on Christianity, but it is probably the most negative portrayal of Jesus you can find. Wow. Again, I think that once Christians wake up and realize that they've been drinking the Kool-Aid served up by Schofield and his spiritual progeny, this is a time for an awakening. This is a time for the lights to come on, for the eyes to be opened, and see that, look, here, there's more to this story. There's more to be told. There's more to be examined, more to be explored. So the question is, why would Jesus be portrayed this way, particularly in this list where there's no direct reference to his crimes? The punishment, according to the Talmud, seems to match the crime. Why? Schaeffer provides some speculation here that's interesting. I think it's interesting for two reasons. He says, well, I think it's interesting, but he offers two reasons to suggest why he believes that the eternal crime or eternal punishment presented in the Talmud is associated with Jesus. First of all, where Jesus makes this comment, now Schaeffer clearly has read and interacted with the Gospels. There's no doubt, and probably on a very high level. However, from a perspective, from a non-believer's perspective, from an unbeliever's perspective, where Jesus says, it's not what goes in, but what comes out that defiles. So he thinks that, of course, you think about the sayings of Jesus, they would have circulated wide, okay? And that comment is probably a comment that you're going to find, and then also you find the teaching in the book of Acts chapter 10, where Jewish Christians are now maybe eating things that were considered defiling. For example, like probably pork or something like that. Second, he speculates it could be a reference to Jesus' comment about his body and his flesh and blood being the basis of what we would call the Lord's Supper, some refer to as the Eucharist. He speculates that either one of those, if not both, could be the basis of that. Again, it's a speculation. I think he makes a pretty strong case. You can't definitively say that it's for certain. Because why? Well, the Talmud isn't presenting a historical record of Jesus. It's 3 centuries approximately, well, really, probably about 250 years later, maybe a little earlier. Maybe you got it as early as 150 to 200 years later, because you have Celsus' works that's preserved in Origen's his response, his counter to Celsus' view of Jesus. So you probably have it early on, these counter narratives, but it's important for us to understand that, look, if you're going to share the gospel with somebody who is informed in the rabbinic Jewish faith and practicing it, you're not just going to be able to walk in with the bumper sticker gospel. You're going to have to have an honest conversation about the portrayal of Jesus in the Talmud, which doesn't purport to present a historical picture of Jesus, but an exaggerated, inflammatory view of Jesus as someone not only who leads others to hell, but someone who's deserving not just of hell, but of the worst kind of punishment in hell for eternity. If we're not prepared to have an honest conversation about those views, then I don't believe that we're going to be prepared to, if you will, till up soil that where we can plant the faithful seeds of the gospel. That's why it's important. And two, I think it's also important that evangelicals wake up and realize that, you're basically being told over and over again that the nation of Israel can do no wrong, that anything that they do that evangelicals must endorse, that we can't even be critical at all. Well, we can be. We can be critical. We can be critical in the same way that we can be critical of any other nation state and its interactions with others. Two, I think that's also bred this, and I want to be very careful, but I do think this is one of those times where I can use the term accurately. It's bred within evangelicalism a racism over and against Palestinian people. Now, while I do not support any way, shape, or form any group that would use terrorism or any form of it on its own people or people that of other ethnicities. For example, Hamas is a terrorist organization, but you got to understand that Palestinians, the sum total Palestinians are not Hamas. Hamas is an organization, a political party that's a terrorist group that subjugates its own people. So when Israel's taking on Hamas, well, I'm for the free people of Israel taking on Hamas, but I'm not opposed to the Palestinian people. And this idea, let me just go political for just a minute. This idea that the Palestinian people should not have the ability to govern themselves or to have their own rights is absurd. And I can tell you, your run-of-the-mill Christian who's been influenced by Schofield and his spiritual progeny will basically take the position that the Palestinians are by and large evil people, and have no rights or claims and shouldn't enjoy the blessings that we do. So here's the answer. Let's take the gospel to all peoples, to all nations, because it's only through the Prince of Peace that true peace will come anyway. So in the end, I think that as I close out this series, I pray that if your eyes are opened and stop drinking the Kool-Aid that's basically being handed down by those who claim to be theologically astute, but yet demonstrate that what they've done is just taken a prepackaged approach to geopolitics based on the very poor scholarship of a man who, frankly, probably was not qualified even to serve in the ministry, and was supported and backed financially by those who had a very clear political agenda to move and shift the political conversation here in the United States, over the past several generations in a way that people, I think, in the United States who love the Lord Jesus Christ, love His church, and love missions, have been largely ignorant to. And I think it's time that we have this awakening in the church where we stop viewing one ethnicity as superior to the other simply because one has put the label on its nation of Israel and then associate that with the Old Testament people and then associate the other people as somehow as evil. The reality is that all are condemned and deserving of eternal damnation and wrath, and only through Christ can anyone be saved. So let's do this. Let's take the side of our King and recognize that both of those people groups that I've just mentioned and both of those nation states, they both need Christ and the gospel. So in the same way that I worked through the episode on Islam, trying to show you what Muslims believe so that you could faithfully share the gospel, the idea here is to show you that, listen, there's been a misrepresentation of what Jews and the Rabbinic Judaism teaches about Jesus to most evangelical Christians. Most evangelical Christians think all you got to do is go read Isaiah 53 to your Jewish neighbor and they're going to believe. It's time that we hit reset, do faithful exegesis of the text that we might teach it faithfully, but also expound faithfully, do faithful exegesis of the context, the religion, and the people that you seek to share the gospel with. Why? Because the nations have been promised to our King. We are the instruments that He's using, and He tells us to go in the Great Commission. Why? Because all authority has been given to Him in heaven and on earth, and because of that, we're to go and convert the nations. Not make converts in the nations, but convert the nations. Well, until then, there can be no excuses, no retreat, and no surrender. Why? Because Jesus Christ is the King of Kings.